Welcome to Chapter 11, everyone. This is the last full chapter of Algebra 1. So this starts out with 1 notes, and we're going to go back to factoring everything. So, for example, it says, what is the simplified form of x minus 1 over 5x minus 5? So I'm going to first take a look at that top line. What goes into x and 1? The only answer is going to be a 1. So I'm going to take out a 1, and that leaves me with x minus 1 left over. On the bottom, I have to take a look what goes into 5x and 5. The answer should be a 5. And again, that leaves me with x minus 1. Now notice that my x minus 1 and my x minus 1 line up. The nice thing about these is because one's on top of the fraction and one's on the bottom, they actually cross each other out. So I'm just left with 1/5 as my answer. That's all there is to it. Example 2 uses that same problem, but it's asking, are there any excluded values? So that's just saying, are there any values for x that would make this impossible to do? So what you do is you just worry about the bottom. This lower part of the fraction cannot be 0. If you try and divide by 0, you break the rules of math and you get an error on your calculator. So the only time that this fraction wouldn't work is if the lower part is 0. So I'm going to take that lower part, the 5x minus 5, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. Then I solve for x. So add 5 to both sides. 5x equals 5, and then divide by 5. So my only excluded value would be when x equals 1. That's the only time if x equals 1, I plug it in, the bottom here would be 0, and I can't divide by 0. So moving on, example 3. Again, it's asking what is the simplified form. So I want to factor as much as possible. On the top, I have 3x minus 6. So what goes into 3 and 6? The answer is a 3. That leaves behind x minus 2. Then I go to the bottom part. Now notice in the bottom part, I go from having 2 terms to 3 terms. This should look familiar. X squared plus x squared plus x minus 6. Because there are 3 parts, I can use the x method of factoring. The negative 6 is going to go at the top, and the middle number should be a 1. So that's going to go at the bottom. Now I need 2 numbers that multiply to a negative 6 and add to a positive 1. So the only 2 numbers would be positive 3, negative 2. So my factors, because there's not a number in front of the x squared, are just going to be x plus 3 and x minus 2. So now the lower part is factored. You should also notice that I now have something that I can cross out. I can cross out the x minus 2 because it happens in the top and the bottom of the fraction. So my simplified fraction leaves me with just 3 on the top and x plus 3 on the bottom. Okay, so now I go to example 4, and it says state the excluded values. Well, I've already done all this work since it's the same problem, so I'm going to scoot this over. This is what I'm starting with. This is simplified. So x3 over x plus 3. Again, if it's asking for excluded values, it's asking for values that will not work. So I'm going to take the bottom part here, the x plus 3, and set that equal to 0. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides to get an excluded value of x equals negative 3. That's going to be the only value that doesn't work when you plug it into this equation. It'll be a 0 on the bottom. Okay? So this next one, example 5. is asking what is the simplified form of 4 minus x squared. Now, it does have two parts, so I cannot use the x method. However, notice how they're both 4 and x squared. I have an x squared here, which is a little bit different. This is going to take you back to the square root factoring. So to factor this, I have to take the square root of 4, and I have to take the square root of x to the second. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of x to the second is x. So to factor the top part, I'll have 2 plus x as one parenthesis, and then in my other parenthesis, I'll have 2 minus x. Okay, that's going back to square root factoring. On the bottom, I also have two terms, but notice this x does not have a squared on it. So I'm going back to saying, okay, what can I take out? What's common between 7x and 14? Well, I can take out a 7, so I'll do that, and that leaves me with x minus 2. Okay, notice how right now I'm close. I have x and negative 2 here, but up here I have a 2 first and then an x, and a 2 first and then an x. So what I can do is on the top, I can take out a negative 1. Okay, so I take out a negative 1, and what that allows me to do is on this one where I was close, I can actually flip the 2 around. So instead of 2 minus x, if I take out a negative 1, I can now say it's x minus 2. Now I can only do that with one of the parentheses. So this parenthesis that had the plus sign, I have to keep as 2 plus x. And then on the bottom, I would keep 7 with x minus 2. Now the reason I do this is so that I can actually cross out the x minus 2. I cannot cross them out unless they're exactly the same. Okay, so what's left? Well, on the top, I'm left with a negative 1 with a parenthesis 2 plus x. On the bottom, I'm just left with 7. So that is my simplified fraction. Okay. So for the bottom, state the excluded values. So if I take the bottom of this fraction, 7x minus 14, and I set it equal to 0, I can solve and add 14. So I get 7x equals 14, divide by 2, divide by 2. So I get an excluded value of x equals, sorry, don't divide by 2, divide by 7. Apologize for that. So my excluded value should be 2. I was getting ahead of myself. Okay, so that's my excluded value.